Next, we have Leanne Barrett, genetic counsellor. What is the psychosocial impact of living with vascular EDS?
So, good afternoon everyone. So my talk today is looking at the psychosocial impact of living with vascular EDS. There you go. So I had the honour of speaking to a vast majority of you about your experiences living with vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I'm basically going to talk you through a little bit about the kind of rationale for the research, so why we felt it was needed. And I want to spend most of the time kind of talking about the results and what was found, because I think that's quite important and really highlights kind of the purpose and need for the research that was done. So this is just a quote that's lifted from Byers et al., who in one of his research studies was talking about the kind of physical aspects of vascular EDS, but very clearly highlighted that the psychosocial impact of the condition is too often neglected. And that was definitely something that I found conducting this research, both before I'd done it and even while I was speaking to participants who took part in the study. So I conducted a literature review, which again very clearly highlighted the lack of research in this area. So instead of being able to draw on experiences from vascular EDS studies that had looked at kind of the psychosocial impact of the condition, I actually had to sort of spread my wings a little bit and look at different conditions or related disorders. So the main thing I sort of got from the vascular EDS studies was that there was none done in the UK, and any studies that had been done that looked at vascular EDS were usually combined with other conditions. So there wasn't anything kind of just focusing on the vascular EDS experience. I then looked at some other sudden death disorders, so long QT syndrome and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, again trying to get an idea of what those experiences were like, but being aware that they are still different conditions to meds. And then I looked at different types of EDS as well, so the classical and hypermobile type, again, same kind of concept. And lastly, I looked at the aortopathy, so looked at low EDS syndrome and Marfan syndrome. So this is just a very large summary of the things that popped up in this sort of literature review that I did when looking at these related conditions. And a lot of the stuff that was found from the literature review, I also kind of then was able to identify after speaking to participants with vascular EDS. But I guess the main thing to highlight was that there was nothing that had been done in this area before. And so this was kind of the first project to look at the psychosocial impact of living with the condition. So kind of the things that I found in my literature review very much influenced what the aims and objectives were for this study. So I was looking at the day-to-day experiences of living with vascular EDS, the impact of living with the condition on work and study, how it is to live with a life-limiting condition, mental health, social life and relationships was a big thing, and also looking at kind of this whole idea of having a family, concerns and perceptions around having children, and that kind of all led into their own separate themes, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail. So just a little overview on what I did with my study. So I recruited through Annabelle's challenge, that's why I'm here, and I started off the interview process with an initial phone call, just to touch base with those of you that were interested in taking part in the study, give you a little bit more of an idea of what it was going to involve before you signed up. I then conducted interviews, so these were kind of semi-structured interviews over the telephone. This was done in 2019, the interviews, and they were meant to last between 45 minutes to an hour. Most of them did, some of them overran a little bit. And I also then did a debrief phone call, because I just felt that the idea of speaking to a complete stranger about your experience of living with a condition for the first time is a lot, and it might bring up things that you're not used to discussing. So a month later we kind of scheduled in a debrief call just to check in, see how individuals felt after sharing that information and if there was anything else that they wanted to add. I then analysed my data using thematic analysis, and that enabled me to pull up the themes that I then identified. So the results. In total, 34 consent forms were returned, and of those 34 consent forms, I interviewed 21 participants, which is amazing and a really good turnout. 18 of which were women and 3 of which were men, and the ages ranged between 19 and 61 years old. So as I said, the research kind of helped identify these 6 key themes, and I'm going to talk about each and every one of these in a bit more detail with a few quotes from the research that I've lifted. So physical limitations to daily life has been brought up today, and I think it really highlights the kind of relationship between the impact on your physical health and how that impacts your mental health and day-to-day living. So these were kind of the things that popped up. So fatigue and pain were quite big factors for individuals in terms of the condition limiting their day-to-day activity, their day-to-day lives and their experiences. This idea of time and energy management was quite pivotal, and I think again has been brought up today, and this was kind of centred on the idea that you have a limited amount of energy and time to do certain things, and if you are going to do more than you should, then that's kind of on borrowed time, and the energy that you've used to do that extra thing is going to have to be taken from somewhere else. And then engaging in social activities. So a lot of participants said that, you know, up until the day they'd be really up for going out or going on this social activity, and it might get to the day and they are just exhausted and can't go through with it, and that kind of again unveiled this idea of not being able to communicate that with friends and family who may not understand their reasons for not engaging in activities. The inability to carry out activities and tasks. So I think this quote here was a really nice summary of the idea that simple things, which is how a lot of participants describe them, so things like opening a can of beans or climbing the stairs at night before bed, tasks that we individuals without veds may not blink an eye at, but actually are huge challenges in the day-to-day lives of those with the condition. Intimacy was something that came up, which wasn't actually set out in my research aims and objectives, but it was something that came up quite a lot and I thought was worth bringing up and mentioning. So this idea of being intimate with your partner and what that means for individuals that are affected and how they feel about that. And then this idea of achievements and accomplishments. So comparing, participants mentioned comparing their lives to their peers or their colleagues and thinking about where they would have been if they didn't have the condition. And this idea of adjustment was quite a big thing in kind of accepting the diagnosis and how that limits their life and what that means for what they kind of expect from themselves in terms of what they want to achieve. So one of the other things that came up was risk perception and existential thoughts. This was quite a big theme throughout pretty much everything, and it ties in kind of with all of them. So this idea of living cautiously, and the phrase ticking time bomb came up continuously throughout the interviews, which is why I've used this quote here. And then the uncertainty of living with the condition. So what does it mean in terms of not knowing, you know, how much longer you've got left, how long that time frame is, if there is one, and that again kind of nicely led into this concept of the future. So which I think was summarised quite nicely with this quote about trying to get this balance of planning for the future and looking forward to things and having things to look forward to, but also living in the moment and not doing something because you might, you know, you don't know what that would look like in terms of the next week and how they would feel. And there was a lot of conversation about what if. So what if I didn't have this diagnosis? What would that mean for me? And you know, how having the condition has affected most of the decisions that a lot of individuals have made in their lives, and that ranged from kind of work, study, having a family, things like that. And then there was this concept of feeling different to other people, which again wasn't something that I'd really planned on touching on, but was again brought up by participants in the study, and it was really just this idea of feeling not normal, and this concept of knowing that there is something that limits them from living their lives the way they want to, and being very aware of that amongst their family and their friends and those around them. And then lastly, something which I think was really interesting was this concept of vascular EDS being an invisible condition. So as much as some individuals that are affected have physical symptoms of the condition, some individuals you wouldn't necessarily know have the condition, and a lot of participants found it quite difficult articulating that to friends and colleagues when, if people look at them, they look normal in a sense. So there was a lot of conversation around that as well across the interviews. And I've actually given a whole slide to this section of obtaining a diagnosis, because I found it really interesting how conflicting and how different the experiences were from participants about receiving their diagnosis. So for some people it was a relief, and I think we've heard from individuals today that have spoken about this sense of, I knew something was wrong and I was right, and I'm happy that this has now been found. But on the flip side, there was this conversation about actually, was it easier not knowing? And now I know I've put these things in my life and I stopped doing the things that I enjoy because I know about the diagnosis. So especially at the bottom about deliberating a decision to have a diagnosis. one participant said, because now I've got the results, I'm not sure I wanted to know. And it was just this conversation about that shift in dynamic of now you know how differently you're living your life in light of the diagnosis. Communication and support was a huge theme and ties quite nicely into Claire's talk as well, about communicating within families and with friends and within a support group. So when we were talking about discussing the diagnosis within the family unit, there was this two sides of the spectrum. So discussing the diagnosis, bringing the family closer together, welcoming those conversations about the condition and what that means in the future for other members of the family, but also this idea of protection and not wanting to upset family members by discussing the condition or how an individual felt, came up quite dominantly throughout the interviews. And similarly, the same kind of concept was seen amongst friends as well. So a lot of the participants reported that disclosing their diagnosis to their friends impacted those friendships, and they noticed a difference. And that kind of led to people not telling their friends about the condition and not wanting to burden them. So burden and guilt was quite a big theme that came up as well amongst all of these things. And then the kind of striking a balance between being part of the support group. Obviously Annabelle Challenge is amazing and does some amazing things, and that was commented throughout all the participants, and I think has been mentioned throughout the day-to-day about having this idea of meeting people that understand your experience and have that lived experience that you also have. But also in that, building relationships within the community means that if somebody isn't well or is going through something, you're kind of faced with the reality of the condition all over again, and that was something that came up quite a few times, and one participant kind of summarised it as a double-edged sword, that you get the support, but also it can be very emotive if somebody within the community that you are close to or had a relationship with is unwell, and that kind of concept. Then there was also a discussion about when to tell and how to tell, so again tying in with what Claire was just talking about, and this was kind of across the board, so with family members, with friends, dating, when is the right time to tell someone about this diagnosis. So some people said they just wouldn't mention it, and if, especially in a dating context, if it then got a bit more serious, they'd feel more comfortable bringing it up. But there was this idea that once you tell someone, it's there and the elephant in the room has been addressed. There was a lot of discussion about how vascular EDS had become a barrier in relationships. So I had quite a few quotes on this, so I didn't necessarily lift any from the research, but it was this idea of there being a shift in dynamic. Within a family unit, for example, an affected parent may be having children who were unaffected, and those children essentially becoming a carer, not telling or not discussing the diagnosis because of this idea of protection. And then retrospective thoughts about entering new relationships. So what would it have looked like if I didn't get into a relationship with someone and actually just dealt with this on my own and didn't feel the burden of knowing that it's not just me journeying through this diagnosis, but there's people that I love and people that I care about that are also going through it as well. And then I think something that has come up a fair few times today, this idea of kind of a lack of faith in healthcare professionals, and just constant frustration, feeling that they're not heard, and that, as someone mentioned earlier, about taking ownership of the condition and being an expert, because if you're not an expert, nobody else is going to advocate for you. So that was another thing that came up quite a lot throughout the research. We then moved on to we're now on a theme about responsibility. And I called it a world of responsibility because that is exactly what it felt like, that there was different aspects for each participant, and how the condition made them feel responsible for their own world, but the worlds of those around them. So this concern for future generations was huge. As I mentioned before, about parental guilt, so feeling guilty that it's been passed on in the family, for example, but also protection. So if something happens to the parent and they have children, who's going to advocate for their children if they're not there anymore? There was also a discussion about personal health and management, so managing your own health, and again kind of tying in with this ownership of the condition, that you must become the master, was something that one participant said. And again, the kind of shift in care, so in this example, an affected mum felt that her daughter became mum within the household and ended up looking after her, and that the responsibility within the household had then shifted. And lastly, raising awareness, so this idea of companionship, and again, kind of similar to what I was talking about before, with being part of a charity or a community of individuals who also understand what you're going through. that led to a lot of people who were older and affected with the condition feeling that actually sharing their experiences would continue to give people hope. And I think that was something that was mentioned earlier by Claire about, being open about what you've been through can actually be quite inspiring for other people who are younger and going through the similar situations. And then there was another thing that came up was this idea of career progression. So where would individuals be if they didn't have the diagnosis? What would they be doing? And kind of this idea of being defeated by vascular EDS if they hadn't gone on to do the things that they wanted to do. And financial uncertainty, again, wasn't something that I'd set out to look at within my objectives, but came up quite a few times. So this idea of paying into a pension. Should you pay into a pension, or should you just enjoy the money now because you don't know what the future holds? Loss was a huge theme, and again showed up in many different ways. So individuals reported a loss of identity, wondering who you would be if you didn't have the diagnosis, and this idea of independence and the desire to socialise. So a lot of participants reported being very independent people and now knowing about their diagnosis or seeing how the condition has affected them, needing to more heavily rely on those around them. And I've mentioned at the bottom there that the desire to socialise actually was different depending on when an individual was diagnosed. So interestingly, for those that were diagnosed at a younger age, they were a lot more anxious and conscious about socialising with their peers, less likely to go out and want to engage in social activity. But those that were diagnosed later on in life, so had reached a diagnosis kind of after they'd had their children and had been living their lives without a diagnosis, were a lot more open to going out, meeting friends, doing things and keeping themselves busy. There was then a lot of conversation about pregnancy and having a family, so this idea of anticipated loss, so growing up thinking that having a family is something that you wanted to do, and suddenly being diagnosed with vascular EDS and that maybe not being something that is possible for them in the future now. But then on the flip side of that, retrospectively thinking, so for individuals who are diagnosed later in life, if I knew about the condition earlier, would I have gone on to have my children? And then lastly, the kind of lasting impact of vascular EDS. So for many of the participants that I spoke to, they weren't necessarily the first person in their family to have the condition. And we kind of spoke a lot about this idea of watching other people in the family go through it and then knowing what that means for you, but also knowing how you felt watching them go through it and what that means for your children. So almost like a little funnel effect, if you like. Sorry, I'm going to try and whiz through these because I'm running out of time. So one of the other things that I thought I really wanted to bring light to was resilience and coping mechanisms, and I think throughout today we've learned that people with this condition are very resilient, and that was one thing that I really picked up on from this from my participants. Most of them had a really positive attitude and outlook on life, so this kind of accepting that these are the cards they've been dealt with, but actually they can still live a great life and just adjust to what the restrictions the condition brings them. I think exercise has come up again previously today, but again, kind of the importance of exercise and physical and mental health came up quite a bit, and a lot of participants reported that it was pivotal in their experience trying to stay positive living with the condition. There was a few comments and a few thoughts about kind of compartmentalising the condition, so this idea of putting vascular EDS in a box and just living life as they would normally. And every single participant was very appreciative and very grateful for their life and the life that they were living, despite their circumstances. And just another thing that I wanted to touch on was this idea of providing a voice to the unheard. So every participant actually was very grateful for the opportunity to speak about their experiences. I think especially in the format of an interview where they were given the opportunity to talk quite freely. And you can see here that it gave them a sense of empowerment. So signing up to the research project to feel like they can make a difference. But also talking to somebody that isn't part of their family, for example, removes that emotive kind of conversation so that you can just be free and express how they feel. So I'll just whiz through this bit, but one of the things I did look at was mental health and access to mental health support. So a lot of participants mentioned that they had access to mental health support. That was usually in the form of kind of CBT and talking therapies, and those that hadn't necessarily accessed it felt that it was something that would be beneficial to them in managing and living with their diagnosis. And then this slide isn't revolutionary after the talks we've had today, but I asked about how we could improve the experience for patients and what that would look like. As we know, increased awareness from healthcare professionals was like top of the list from every patient, every participant in most cases. But also the idea of group meetups and meeting with individuals. So when I did this research, it was in 2019, and then obviously 2020 went into the pandemic, but hopefully now it sounds like those things are lifting off the ground again as well. And I just quickly want to run through some of the future psychosocial research opportunities that I personally feel would be really beneficial to kind of get an idea and hear more about the experiences of those with the condition. So even though I had 21 participants, which was great, you could be really ambitious and have a larger sample size of patients and participants and speak to them about their experiences. Age at diagnosis for me was just something that really stuck out, and I think that would be a really interesting topic to look at, how individuals live their lives if they were diagnosed younger in comparison to when they were diagnosed later in life and had lived most of their lives without knowing about the condition. Studies with more males. The 3 lovely men that were part of my study were great, but it'd be great to get a little bit more of an idea of their experience. Intimacy and relationships, as I said, popped up kind of unexpectedly, but it sounds like that's something that is going to be looked at now, which is great. And then studies looking at quality of life and coping mechanisms. So yeah, I really just want to say thank you to every single participant that took part in that research project. I learned a lot about your experience, and I think it really is just amazing. You're all an amazing group of people. I want to thank Jared and the team at Annabelle's Challenge for supporting me through my project, and also Claire, who was my supervisor and was just fabulous. Thank you all very much.